The shrill voice of the neighborhood's self-appointed HOA enforcer echoed across my driveway. She was seconds away from making a mistake that would flip her world upside down. When I refused to give her the keys, she threatened to call the police, convinced that some divine intervention had delivered her this vehicle. What she didn't realize was that my profession would take her from bold to terrified in an instant. She truly had no clue who she was picking a fight with. Let me paint the picture. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in my suburban neighborhood outside Washington, D.C. My name is Larry Roberts, 50 years old, and I've worked as a federal employee for over 2 decades. Just 6 months earlier, I'd been promoted to federal interior chief, and with that came a move into this neighborhood. The house was everything I wanted: a peaceful street, decent neighbors, and close enough to the office to keep my commute tolerable. In my driveway sat my government-issued SUV. Outwardly, it looked like an ordinary contractor's vehicle, civilian plates, no flashy government identifiers. But beneath the surface, it carried all the markers of federal property: van records, asset tags, the works. For security reasons, I never advertised its true nature. I was sipping coffee, enjoying what felt like a normal morning, when the sound of heavy footsteps came marching toward my driveway. Trouble has a way of announcing itself, and sure enough, that's when I saw her, a woman in her late 40s, eyes wild, stride purposeful, clutching a stack of papers like they gave her divine authority. She jabbed a finger at my SUV with such fury you'd think it had personally wronged her family. "That's my compensation car," she screamed loud enough to wake half the block. I nearly choked on my coffee, thinking this had to be a prank, but the burning conviction in her eyes told me she was dead serious. My training kicked in instantly. "Ma'am, this is my work vehicle," I replied, carefully placing my mug down with controlled calm. She wasn't having it. "God sent it to replace Mark's car," she snapped, voice breaking. "A government vehicle killed my husband." That Nemia market snapped my attention into focus. 3 years earlier, I'd worked a case involving a federal contractor named Mark Evans, who was reported dead in a suspicious hit-and-run. His vehicle had been found abandoned near the Mexican border. No body recovered, blood evidence barely there. Something about that file had never sat right with me. Now here I was, face to face with his widow, handed over as divine justice. She demanded. Her wedding ring caught the sunlight, worn thin from years of anxious twisting. This wasn't just anger. It was grief sharpened into obsession, a dangerous mix. I stood my ground. "I can't give you this vehicle," I said evenly, even as my mind raced through the implications. If she truly believed her husband was killed by a government SUV, then my arrival with one in her neighborhood was either a bizarre coincidence or some kind of cosmic joke. Her face flushed red. "You dare refuse God's will?" she shrieked, fumbling with her phone. Seconds later she was shouting into it, reporting to 911 that I was denying her a compensation car sent by divine order. I could practically hear the dispatcher's confusion from where I stood. By now, the neighbors were peeking out of their homes. Tom Riley from next door already had his phone out, recording the drama. He was a jittery man with a past in federal contracting, and he'd always eyed my SUV with suspicion. Across the street, Mrs. Davis, a retired federal worker, watched with an expression that suggested she saw more than she was letting on. And further down, Maria clutched her purse like it contained secrets too heavy to share. When Officer Ryan Parker finally arrived, his face told me he wasn't used to dealing with federal matters. He had the stiff posture of a man still trying to prove himself. Teresa, because that was the woman's name, thrust a stack of what looked like HOA documents at him, claiming they gave her authority to seize my vehicle. "Ma'am, citizens can't commandeer cars," Parker said with professional patience, though his confusion was obvious. I handed him my cover registration official documents my agency provided for situations exactly like this. It didn't feel good misleading another officer, but protocol was protocol. Teresa, meanwhile, was unwavering. She raised her papers like holy scripture and cried out, "Mark's spirit demands justice. That car is blood debt." And for the first time, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Grief can twist reality, make you see enemies and shadows. But what she didn't know was that I had memorized her husband's case file, and the truth behind his disappearance was far darker than she imagined. Because Mark Evans hadn't just died, he had left behind a secret that would change everything. And I was the only one who knew it. Every time Teresa's growing pile of legal expenses came up, Maria would stiffen like she'd been caught red-handed. It didn't take a genius to figure out why a former HOA treasurer would flinch at the mention of money, especially when Teresa openly bragged about using community funds for printing and consultation fees. The numbers didn't add up, and Maria knew exactly why. When Officer Parker came back to follow up on Teresa's latest complaint about my illegally parked government vehicle, he carried himself with that same overeager energy of a man hoping the right case might earn him federal attention. Teresa proudly thrust her forged HOA documents into his hands, convinced she'd uncovered a legal loophole no one else had ever seen. I watched Parker's expression shift to first confusion, then doubt, and finally the forced neutrality of someone bound by protocol. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "these papers are broken bar. They don't look like standard HOA documents. Associations don't usually have authority to seize vehicles." Teresa was ready. With a fiery conviction that bordered on rehearsed theater, she raised her voice. "My husband's blood cries out for justice." She wasn't exaggerating as she had actually built a shrine to Mark in her living room. Wedding photos, flickering candles, and, as I later learned, even a forged death certificate that could fool most people at a glance. She prayed to that shrine daily, convinced Mark's spirit was guiding her mission to reclaim what she was owed. In her mind, this wasn't harassment or theft, it was divine restitution backed by law. That was the part that unsettled me most, her ability to rationalize. Teresa had painted me and her story as just another cog in the same machine that killed her husband and buried the truth. Taking my SUV wasn't theft, it was rightful compensation. She told anyone who would listen that the government was a faceless beast destroying families and hiding behind bureaucracy. If you didn't know the truth about Mark Evans, you might almost believe her. The neighborhood had started to fracture under the pressure. Mrs. Davis gave polite nods to Teresa in public but flashed me small, reassuring looks whenever she thought no one was watching. Tom, meanwhile, was torn. His contractor experience made him suspect my cover story didn't hold water, but his fear of becoming Teresa's next target kept him silent. And Maria broken bar, well, her guilt was becoming impossible to hide. She clung to her purse like it carried proof of her complicity. Parker, for his part, was clearly drowning in a situation far outside his training. I documented everything for the inevitable federal case, all while debating whether to drop my cover and shut this circus down myself. The tipping point came when Teresa unveiled her plan, a legal seizure ceremony. She intended to formally transfer ownership of my SUV to herself in front of the entire neighborhood. She spent HOA funds to print elaborate official transfer papers, even hiring what she described as a legal observer to witness the event. In her mind, she wasn't a vandal or a fraud, as she was a crusading widow taking the righteous path against government corruption. What she couldn't see was that every forged document, every false claim, and every misused community dollar was stacking up into a federal case that would crush her harder than any hit-and-run ever could. And then Tom uncovered something that would blow the lid off the entire situation. Late one night, while reviewing his endless pile of security footage, his cameras caught Teresa outside in her pajamas and a coat, whispering to my SUV like it was a priest hearing her confessions. But this wasn't a quiet vigil, this was action. The hiss of spray paint echoed in the night as she scrawled blood debt across the driver's side door in dripping red letters. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "This is for you, Mark. Same kind of car that took you away. Now it pays." Methodically, almost ritualistically, she slashed my front tires with a kitchen knife, muttering what sounded like a prayer. She smashed the side mirror with a hammer, deliberate, not frenzied. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a ceremony. By the time she finished, she had inflicted over $4,000 in damage. And thanks to Tom's cameras, the entire act was recorded: video, audio, and her whispered confession. To Teresa, this wasn't vandalism at all. It was justice. She wasn't committing crimes, she was carrying out sacred duty. The next morning, as I stood in front of the dripping red letters, I felt the strange balance every federal employee knows too well: duty pulling me one way, compassion tugging the other. I had no choice but to report it to my agency's security office. And once federal investigators stepped in, Teresa's fragile world was going to implode. Tom's discovery didn't come from his camera, so it came later, from a database he stumbled into while digging deeper. He nearly dropped his coffee when he read the words, Mark Evans, a Federal Witness Protection Program, death faked, current identity, Marco Valdez, Guadalajara, Mexico. Tom stared at the screen, rag twisting in his hands, as the truth sank in. Teresa wasn't a widow. She'd been grieving a man who was still alive. And now Tom faced a terrible choice: reveal the truth and risk breaking her mind completely, or stay silent and let her march into federal prison. Tom was wearing through rags like a nervous mechanic, wiping his hands raw while wrestling with the choice between truth and mercy. He knew either decision could destroy Teresa in a different way. The whole neighborhood was starting to feel the strain. Mrs. Davis, with her usual cryptic wisdom, began dropping pointed remarks about people speaking without knowing the full story, and about how certain law enforcement officers never got the respect they deserved. Maria's guilty habit of clutching her purse had become so obvious that even Teresa noticed it, but she mistook it for nervous solidarity rather than what it really was: the weight of embezzlement eating Maria alive. Officer Parker, meanwhile, was stuck in his own quiet crisis. He recognized this circus was way beyond his pay grade, but pride kept him from admitting he needed federal backup. And me? I was balancing on a razor's edge, a federal officer by duty, civilian contractor by cover. Every day brought some new escalation from Teresa: another bogus legal document, another speech rehearsed at Mark's shrine, another plan for how she'd seize my SUV. Tom's cameras captured everything. At 2 in the morning, she'd stand in front of her flickering candles, reciting lines like a courtroom actress preparing for trial, watching a grieving widow rehearse felony property seizures for a husband who wasn't even dead. It felt like a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. Then the internet got involved. It started with a clip Tom quietly shared in the neighborhood chat, a bizarre video of Teresa practicing on another neighbor's car before she attacked mine. Pajamas, hammer, whispered Teresa. It was equal parts pitiful and unsettling. The video escaped the neighborhood group, spread to social media, and before long, strangers across the country were cracking jokes about the HOA widow warrior and suburban Karen on a divine mission. Thousands of views rolled in within days. From where I stood, though, there was nothing funny about it. I knew exactly what was coming. 2 decades in federal service teaches you to recognize when someone is about to cross a point of no return. Teresa wasn't just spiraling anymore, she was accelerating toward a public crash, one that would leave her neck deep in federal charges. But my hands were tied. My agency protocol required me to maintain cover until there was undeniable evidence of a federal crime. That meant standing by, watching her walk toward the edge of a cliff, and being legally forbidden to pull her back until she jumped. And she was about to jump. She had already booked a tow truck, calling it a community property recovery service. She'd set up live stream channels, scheduled the event, and even started inviting local reporters to cover her victory over government corruption. Teresa truly believed she was about to expose injustice and reclaim her husband's legacy in front of thousands. Meanwhile, Tom carried the one truth that could stop her cold. Mark Evans wasn't dead. He was alive and well in Mexico, living under a new name. The man she mourned had faked his death, stolen money, and walked away without a second glance. Tom knew the truth could save her from prison, but it would also shatter her sanity. What would you do? Destroy a grieving woman's illusion, or watch her destroy her life? Teresa, oblivious, pushed ahead with zeal. She spent the last of the HOA's stolen $15,000 on her operation, hiring the tow truck driver, ordering professionally printed documents, even paying someone she claimed was a legal observer. She framed the whole spectacle as a grassroots rebellion, citizens reclaiming stolen property. Online, her story was exploding. Clips of her midnight trance and garage lawyer speeches racked up over 50,000 views, with comments ranging from sympathy for her grief to memes mocking her divine mission. Local reporters picked it up as a quirky HOA dispute without realizing they were documenting a federal crime in the making. Teresa mistook the attention as proof she was right, that the public supported her crusade against government theft. What she didn't see was the trap she was building for herself. Every live stream, every document, every misused HOA dollar was a breadcrumb trail of premeditation, fraud, and embezzlement. She wasn't dismantling corruption as she was laying out a case file prosecutors could only dream of. Officer Parker's conflict deepened. What started as a neighborhood nuisance had become an obvious federal case. He wanted badly to prove he could handle it, to show he belonged in the big leagues. But he also knew one call to the right office would yank it out of his hands, and with it, his chance to prove himself. Mrs. Davis, the old professional, seemed to know exactly who I was and what I was doing, though she never said it outright. Her protective little smile said enough. "I know what you are. I won't out you." Maria, however, was unraveling. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stand to look at Teresa's shrine without knowing the flowers and candles were bought with stolen home money. $15,000 might not shake Washington, but in a small community budget, it was devastating, and when the truth surfaced, she knew she'd be exposed as complicit. Meanwhile, Teresa transformed her fantasy into a production. She recruited neighbors to act as legal witnesses, paid her so-called observer, and coordinated with local news to film what she called a citizen's stand against government overreach. She'd rehearsed her speech endlessly, practicing the moment she'd climb into my SUV and drive off, triumphant. Here's what chilled me. Teresa didn't see herself as a criminal. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was about to become a hero. In her mind, she wasn't stealing as she was striking a righteous blow for every widow denied justice. She had written herself into a myth, where she would expose corruption, reclaim her blood debt, and prove that ordinary citizens could fight back. And the frightening part, she'd prepared well enough to make it look real. Multiple cameras, backup live stream channels, professionally printed paperwork. Teresa wasn't stumbling anymore as she was staging a full production of her delusion. Teresa had polished her scheme to look almost legitimate. She shut down her distractions, crafted promotional flyers, and even arranged her so-called property recovery event to resemble a real courtroom hearing. Her documents were elaborate counterfeits, peppered with enough legal jargon to fool anyone without a law degree. She dug deep into property statutes, cherry-picking lines she didn't fully understand but could present in a way that sounded convincing to an online audience. Meanwhile, Tom was running out of time. In his phone sat footage of Mark Avenza alive, tan, and thriving in Mexico under a new name, financed by the fortune he siphoned away during his staged death. But in his neighborhood, just a few yards away, he was forced to watch Teresa prepare for what she believed would be the most triumphant day of her life. She wasn't just planning a stunt, she was about to live-stream herself committing multiple federal crimes in honor of a man who was probably sipping cocktails on a beach, completely detached from the fallout. It was the kind of slow-motion disaster that both fascinates and horrifies federal investigators. On one side, a grieving widow, blind to the fact her crusade was built on a lie. On another, a federal officer, me, still undercover, watching it all unravel in real time. Then there was Tomo, the contractor who understood just enough about government operations to see danger coming, but not enough about federal law to predict the scale of the consequences. Add in Mrs. Davis, the retired Fed, quietly trying to shield us all without exposing anyone's cover, and Officer Parker, the small-town cop with stars in his eyes, praying this would be his big career moment. It was a powder keg, and Teresa had already lit the fuse. Neighbors who had once cheered her on were starting to distance themselves. The late-night vandalism, the obsessive rituals, the fake legal posturing, it was all becoming too much. People were whispering about moving, but Teresa only saw hesitation as proof that federal intimidation was working. To her, every doubter was further motivation to prove that ordinary citizens could strike back and win. What none of them expected, not Teresa, not the 15,000 people signed up to her live stream, not even Toma, was that I was about to reveal not one, but two truths that would collapse her entire world. The morning of her so-called divine property recovery came crisp and sharp, the kind of autumn air that makes everything look staged for a movie. By sunrise, our quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a surreal mix of block party and public trial. Teresa took center stage, dressed in a black funeral dress paired with pearls, like she couldn't decide whether she was burying someone or marrying them. Her face radiated grim determination. Either she was about to save the world, or burn it down trying. Tom paced like a man on the verge of a breakdown, wiping sweat and clutching his phone as though it contained nuclear secrets. Mrs. Davis perched on her porch, her posture sharp with the trained patience of someone who had spent decades knowing when federal agents needed backup they couldn't ask for. Parker showed up early, his stance stiff, his eyes scanning the crowd, every inch the small-town officer desperate for a federal-level win. Maria arrived pale and shaken, clutching her purse like a life raft, her guilt leaking out in nervous tremors because she knew her stolen HOA funds were about to be dragged into the light. The crowd swelled. Teresa had promoted her spectacle so effectively that strangers from across multiple towns were pouring in, hoping to witness either poetic justice or a train wreck in real time. Folding tables were lined with counterfeit legal files, cameras were mounted at every angle, and the whole thing looked absurdly official, like a mock trial staged by someone who'd only ever seen courtrooms on TV. Today, Teresa declared, her voice ringing with the conviction of someone who believed she was divinely appointed, we show what happens when ordinary citizens refuse to be silenced by federal corruption. Her live stream exploded with comments, tens of thousands tuning in, the numbers climbing with each passing minute. Some cheered her bravery, others rooted for disaster. Either way, the energy swirled like a storm at landfall. I played my part, washing my SUV in the driveway, feigning ignorance while preparing mentally for the moment I would have to drop cover. Years of federal training ran through my head of how to minimize fallout, how to preserve evidence, and how to control the narrative once the reveal happened. Then it began. Teresa raised a crowbar in one hand, a folder of forged documents in the other, and declared my SUV seized by divine order of compensation. Her livestream chat went wild as she pried at my car door, all while delivering a fiery monologue about corrupt bureaucrats destroying American families. It was passionate, articulate, and terrifyingly unhinged, a tragic proof of a mind collapsing under its own delusions. That was the moment I stepped in. Everyone watching needs to understand something, I said, my voice calm but cutting through the noise like a blade. She is committing federal crimes right now. The chat exploded in disbelief. Why did the clueless contractor suddenly sound like law enforcement issuing a warning? Teresa froze mid-swing, finally registering my tone. I pulled out my credentials and raised them to the cameras, my voice steady as the viewership surged past 20,000. My name is Chief Larry Roberts, U.S. Department of the Interior. The crowd gasped. Teresa's expression shifted from fury to confusion to absolute horror. The crowbar slipped from her hands, clattering against the pavement. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Even the livestream comments seemed to hold their breath. Her world was imploding in front of an audience that had swelled to 25,000. Everything she believed about me, about her husband, about her mission shattered in an instant. That's when Tom acted. Teresa, he shouted, holding up his phone, his nerves finally finding purpose. Your husband Mark isn't dead. The livestream detonated into chaos as 30,000 people tried to process the words. Teresa stood frozen, her body trembling as her reality was ripped apart piece by piece. He's alive, Tom continued, his voice steadier now. He's living in Mexico as Marco Valdez with the money he stole before he faked his death. And in that moment, Teresa let out a sound I'll never forget. The sound that ripped out of Teresa in that moment wasn't human in any ordinary sense. It was grief, fury, betrayal, and disbelief, all tangled together into one shattering wail that echoed down the street and probably blew out the microphones of half the viewers recording. Mark a broken bar, ice a broken bar alive. She shrieked, her voice cracking under the impossible weight of the words. The revelation hit her like a collision of 3 years of mourning, every candlelit vigil, every vigilante justice act, all of it built on a lie. Her husband hadn't died tragically, he had engineered his own disappearance, stolen money in hand, while she spent years defending his honor through crimes of her own. This wasn't grief anymore. Psychologists would call it an acute dissociative crisis, but that sterile phrase didn't capture the sight of a woman watching her entire world collapse in front of 35,000 live viewers. I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm, loud enough to carry but softened by compassion. Teresa Broken Bar, I investigated Mark's case 3 years ago. I knew he staged his death. You were his victim too. The live chat was unreadable, scrolling too quickly to process. But flashes caught my eye. A plot twist of the century. This is better than Netflix. Karen got conned by her own husband. 3 truths had landed on Teresa all at once. Her neighbor was a federal chief. Her husband was alive. And the man she trusted most had scammed her as completely as anyone could be scammed. Her knees buckled, and she dropped hard onto my driveway, staring blankly at the pavement. She whispered, hollow and broken, "He scammed me to a broken bar." Her words sounded like a confession ripped out of her soul. She finally realized that not only had she been mourning a man who still drew breath, but she had spent years sinking herself deeper into criminal schemes for the sake of a lie. Officer Parker edged closer with handcuffs, but even he hesitated. Teresa wasn't resisting as she was unraveling in front of tens of thousands of people. She looked less like a criminal and more like someone whose brain had been split in half. And then Maria, no longer clutching her purse like a guilty shield, chose that moment to spill her own truth. "Teresa," she announced, her voice trembling but firm, "you also stole $15,000 from our community fund, a broken bar, while you were mourning your husband who was in Mexico spending stolen money." The live stream erupted into chaos. Viewers could barely process the avalanche of revelations. Teresa wasn't just guilty of federal crime as she'd also betrayed her own neighbors while destroying her own life for a man who had faked his death. Her arrest was one of the gentlest federal takedowns I've ever seen. She didn't fight. She didn't even seem aware of the cuffs as Parker restrained her. She just kept muttering the same words, over and over, like a broken recording. "Marks alive via broken bar, Marks alive via broken bar." By then, over 45,000 people were watching the complete psychological collapse of a woman who had built her entire identity on lies. She had discovered, in a single hour, that her husband was alive, that she had been targeting a federal officer, and that her grief had been nothing but a con man's cover story. Somewhere in Mexico, Mark was likely sipping a cocktail, living on money stolen from his wife and the government, while she was led away in chains. But that wasn't the end. Federal investigators dug into Mark's case after Teresa's arrest, and what they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned agents. His betrayal ran far deeper than we imagined. The weeks that followed were a blur of interagency coordination. My living room turned into an unofficial command post, crowded with investigators from the Department of the Interior's Inspector General, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and Homeland Security. What started as a bizarre suburban feud had exploded into an international manhunt, complete with embezzlement, fraud, and a viral live stream watched by tens of thousands. Prosecutors started calling it a perfect storm of clear evidence, overlapping jurisdictions, and a media circus that guaranteed results would make headlines. But Teresa's fate depended less on the evidence and more on her mental state. No court would proceed with charges unless she was deemed competent to understand her actions. Her psychiatric evaluation stretched out for weeks. The official diagnosis: grief-induced dissociative disorder with impaired reality processing. In plainer words, her husband tricked her into mourning him while he looted her life, and now she couldn't separate truth from delusion. Even during evaluation sessions, she clung to the idea that this was all a federal conspiracy to discredit her mission. Meanwhile, Tom underwent his own transformation. The nervous neighbor who once couldn't stop wringing his hands became a quiet hero. His decision to expose Mark's survival at the precise moment he did likely spared Teresa heavier charges. Attempted vehicle theft carries a much lighter penalty than a completed theft, especially one that crosses state lines. His courage and quick thinking didn't go unnoticed. Federal agents later tapped him as a consultant for cases involving unstable individuals swayed by misinformation. And Mrs. Davis, she finally got the recognition she deserved. From the beginning, she had quietly documented Teresa's descent, carefully recording each escalation without blowing anyone's cover. 40 years in federal service had taught her the art of silent support, and her discretion likely kept me alive while Teresa spiraled. The Department of the Interior issued her a civilian commendation for exceptional support to federal personnel during operational risk, a polished way of saying, "Thanks for protecting our guy from a dangerous neighbor while he worked undercover." Officer Parker's career took a turn he hadn't quite expected, though it landed him exactly where he'd always wanted to be. His calm and professional management of an increasingly tangled case earned the attention of federal recruiters, who were impressed that he handled overlapping jurisdictions without compromising the evidence trail. Within months, he was accepted into an accelerated program at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Less than a year later, Parker was working federal assignments, his first involving training local officers on how to recognize when seemingly domestic disputes actually involve federal employees or property. Maria's arc turned out to be one of the most unexpected redemptions in the entire ordeal. Once investigators realized her financial misconduct was less about personal greed and more about keeping the community afloat, while Teresa redirected legitimate funds into her spiraling grief-driven crusade, she was recast as a cooperating witness instead of a co-defendant. When she testified against Teresa, it wasn't out of spite, it was out of genuine compassion for someone who had been completely manipulated by a master con artist. Federal Victim Services were so impressed by her balance of loyalty and truth that they brought her in to help other communities identify similar fraud schemes. Meanwhile, the expanded investigation into Mark Evans revealed a web of crime that dwarfed Teresa's destructive antics. Mark hadn't just staged his death to escape a failing marriage, he had engineered a sophisticated fraud operation involving government contracts, shell construction firms, money laundering, and insurance scams triggered by his supposed death. Federal agents discovered that Mark had drained every account he and Teresa shared, cashed out their retirement, and even stolen her modest inheritance, all while orchestrating his disappearing act to Mexico. Catching him, in the end, was almost anticlimactic. Living in Guadalajara under the alias Marco Valdez, Mark flaunted his wealth with flashy cars, luxury apartments, and a lifestyle that screamed for attention. Ironically, it was his unchanged spending habits that tipped off authorities. Mexican banking regulators, already suspicious, collaborated with U.S. investigators. When Mark was finally detained on a visa violation, his first concern wasn't his wife's shattered life, it was whether his assets in Mexico could be seized. Bringing him back to the U.S. became an international exercise in bureaucracy. The State Department had to coordinate with Mexican prosecutors, Treasury demanded its stolen money, and justice needed assurances that he'd face appropriate punishment. The extradition paperwork alone was a months-long ordeal. Teresa's trial captivated the public. Between her live-stream breakdown and the shocking details of Mark's fraud, her case forced prosecutors to navigate the difficult line between her status as a victim and her responsibility for very real crimes. Victim services specialists were heavily involved, ensuring she understood that her grief and manipulation explained her actions but did not excuse them. In the end, the sentences reflected the tangled moral mess. Teresa was given 18 months in federal prison, with credit for time served, ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution, and placed on 3 years probation with mandatory counseling and financial management training. The judge acknowledged her grief but reminded everyone that pain does not justify breaking federal law. Mark received 5 years in prison, full restitution to both Teresa and the government, and additional penalties for staging his death to fuel her crimes. The community was left shaken. Neighbors who had once rallied behind Teresa's fight against corruption had to accept that she had been manipulated into living a lie, funneling her grief into crimes that served only Mark's scheme. The $15,000 she stole from the neighborhood fund was reimbursed through federal restitution, but the fracture in community trust lingered far longer. Federal agencies began using the Evans case as a textbook example of fraud targeting emotional vulnerabilities. Mark's strategy was almost formulaic: create a crisis to mask financial irregularities, fake death to dodge accountability, and let grief keep people from asking questions. The psychological profiles built from his scheme went on to aid investigations into other suspicious deaths and missing contractors. But even after the trials ended, the story wasn't over. 18 months later, Teresa Evans walked out of federal prison into a world that had moved on. The neighborhood she had terrorized and betrayed had changed in ways that almost felt poetic. Her foreclosed home was now owned by a Coast Guard officer and his wife, who happened to work as a civilian contractor for Theo Broken Bar. Teresa's old home had taken on a new identity. The foreclosed property was now owned by a Coast Guard officer and his wife, a civilian employee with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Where Teresa once staged fiery speeches about government oppression, There now stood 2 federal vehicles in the driveway and a modest American flag waving on the lawn. The space once reserved for her shrine to the supposedly deceased Mark had been replaced by a tidy, year-round garden that symbolized renewal instead of grief locked in place. Each day, Teresa rode the city bus past her former neighborhood, a harsh reminder of how far her life had unraveled. On her way to her low-paying job at a document-scanning company, the only place willing to hire someone with a federal felony record, she watched the very people she once accused of being part of a grand conspiracy go about their ordinary suburban lives, collecting mail, warming up cars, waving at neighbors. Meanwhile, others had found new purpose in the wreckage of Teresa's collapse. Tom had become something of a minor celebrity among federal contractors. His quick action during Teresa's breakdown and his honesty about Mark's fake death earned him credibility as a security consultant. He now advised government agencies on spotting potential risks tied to unstable neighbors or contractors. His doorbell camera footage of Teresa's unraveling had even been adopted into federal security training as a cautionary example of how quickly domestic drama can escalate into federal crimes. Mrs. Davis embraced an unofficial leadership role, using her experience to protect fellow federal employees in their suburban communities. She organized barbecues for government families, created guides for navigating anti-government hostility, and built a quiet network of retirees who could step in when tensions ran high. Officer Parker, now a federal agent, was thriving. His calm, evidence-driven response during Teresa's meltdown had propelled him into a career handling financial fraud cases that targeted government workers. Occasionally, he drove through his old patrol routes, not as a local cop but as a federal investigator, always remembering how one neighborhood dispute had escalated into a national lesson. Maria transformed her shame into strength. No longer weighed down by guilt, she became an outspoken advocate against financial manipulation, speaking at conferences and helping other communities recognize schemes like Mark's. What once made her clutch her purse in fear now fueled her confidence in safeguarding others. As for Mark, prison life stripped him of the grandeur he once clung to. Inmates weren't impressed by his elaborate fake death plot. His exploitation of his wife's grief, coupled with siphoning her inheritance, made him despised even in a white-collar unit. Ironically, his prison work detail involved cleaning federal vehicles, a small dose of poetic justice requested by prosecutors. Teresa, however, found moving forward nearly impossible. Her breakdown video had gone viral, racking up millions of views and endless reaction memes. Strangers recognized her on public transport, whispering her name. Job applications went now eerie. Employers only needed a quick search to uncover her crimes and her infamous live stream. The financial restitution process had stripped her of everything she thought was hers, including the house and assets she assumed were earned legitimately. Investigators proved nearly all of it had been financed by Mark's fraud. In the end, she was left only with the modest earnings from her retail jobs, barely enough for a small apartment. Nowhere near the life she once flaunted in her 4-bedroom home. The community she left behind had moved on, building new traditions that served as subtle reminders of the dangers of letting grief cloud judgment. Their annual barbecue now included a moment of appreciation for federal employees and their families, a quiet acknowledgement of both their service and their humanity. My own life stabilized as well. The recognition from handling the case with minimal fallout earned me a promotion and a post with stronger security protocols. The neighborhood itself was calmer, and having my credentials validated in front of 30,000 witnesses discouraged anyone from treating me or others like me as easy targets. 2 years after Teresa's infamous demand for my government-issued car, the phone rang. "Chief Roberts," the voice said. "We've got another HOA dispute. Someone's claiming divine authority over a federal employee's vehicle. Says God told her the car belongs to her dead husband." I couldn't help laughing. "Are we absolutely sure the husband's really dead this time?" I replied. "Send Tom Riley to confirm. He's practically our resident expert on spotting fake deaths." Some people never learn. Before you demand someone's government car in the name of divine justice, you might want to confirm your late spouse isn't actually alive, enjoying your money in another country. Here at Ya Stories, We believe that behind every wild tale lies a deeper truth about human behavior and the consequences of our choices. If this roller coaster of federal justice served cold made your day, hit that like button and stick around because next time, we'll dive into another unbelievable story proving that reality will always outshine fiction. Until then, keep listening for those echoes of justice in your own life.